There is a question that disappears in the noise of headlines. Not will the United States strike Iran, and not will Iran open the strait. The real question is this: why is the most powerful military force in the history of human civilization unable, for over 5 weeks now, to open a waterway that is just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point? Think about that number for a moment. 21 miles. And yet, aircraft carrier strike groups, stealth bombers, cruise missiles, the full weight of American military power, all of it is pressing against a coastline defended by mobile missile batteries, cheap drones, and sea mines. And the strait remains effectively closed. That paradox is where this analysis has to begin. Let me walk you through the structure of what has happened, because the events unfolded in layers, and each layer reveals something the news cycle has missed. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iran under Operation Epic Fury, targeting military facilities, nuclear sites, and leadership, resulting in the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Iran responded by launching retaliatory missile and drone attacks on U.S. military bases, Israeli territory, and Gulf states, while its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued warnings prohibiting vessel passage through the Strait of Hormuz, leading to an effective halt in shipping traffic. Before the war, as many as 140 ships passed through the strait every single day. That flow stopped. Now we are on day 37 of the conflict. A U.S. F-15E fighter jet, the first confirmed American aircraft lost to enemy fire in this war, was shot down over southern Iran. A dramatic rescue operation unfolded behind enemy lines, and the missing crew member has been recovered. Iran simultaneously claimed it destroyed several U.S. aircraft involved in that rescue mission, and just 1 day earlier, an A-10 Warthog was also hit near the strait. These two events shatter the narrative that the United States has established complete dominance over Iranian airspace, a narrative that Trump himself had been repeating. And then, hours after the rescue announcement, Trump posted on Truth Social in all capitals, "Open the strait, or Tuesday will be Power Plant Day and Bridge Day, all wrapped up in one." The language was raw, profane, and deliberate. This is not simply an emotional outburst. This is a symptom of a crisis that has long since escaped the boundaries of a bilateral confrontation. Before we go deeper into today, let us slow down for a moment and look back. History offers us several precise analogies, not decorative ones, but structurally relevant ones. The first is the tanker war of the 1980s. In 1987 and 1988, American forces conducted operations in the Persian Gulf against Iranian threats to international shipping. The U.S. reflagged Kuwaiti tankers and escorted them through the strait. Iran responded with mines. America destroyed Iranian naval vessels and oil platforms. But neither side was able to force a political outcome through military action alone. The conflict ended only after Iran was exhausted by 8 years of war with Iraq and accepted a UN ceasefire resolution. The lesson is clear. Military force produced tactical results, but not a political solution. The second analogy is the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. That crisis ended not because one side won, but because both sides found a face-saving exit through secret diplomacy. Kennedy publicly triumphed. The Soviets quietly got U.S. missiles removed from Turkey. Today, we see the same dynamic. Indirect negotiations have been led by Vice President Vance and Iran's Speaker of Parliament, with the mediation of Pakistan's military chief. Mediators from Pakistan, Turkey, and Egypt are working to bring the two sides back to the table. Neither Washington nor Tehran can surrender publicly, which means any resolution will almost certainly be quiet, indirect, and dressed up as something else. The third analogy, and the most uncomfortable one, is the Suez Crisis of 1956. Britain and France used military force to retake the canal. They won on the battlefield. But they lost strategically, catastrophically. The United States forced its own allies to withdraw. Egypt kept the canal, and the European powers never recovered their status as global hegemons. The question worth sitting with today is whether the United States risks walking into a mirror image of that trap, winning tactically in a narrow waterway while losing strategically on the global board. Now let us go to the military and technical level, because there is a detail here that deserves far more attention than it receives. Iran's ability to wreak havoc in the global economy by paralyzing commercial shipping through the strait has proved a major strategic advantage, and world leaders have struggled to figure out how to reopen the waterway. The reason is asymmetry. The United States is spending enormous resources striking fixed, expensive targets: radar installations, command centers, bridges. Iran is responding with cheap, decentralized, dispersed systems, drones that cost a few $1,000s, anti-ship missiles launched from mobile platforms on 1,000 miles of coastline, and mines that are extraordinarily difficult to clear under active threat conditions. At least a dozen Iranian mines are currently confirmed in the strait, according to American intelligence assessments. U.S. Central Command has struck more than 9,000 Iranian targets and flown upward of 9,000 combat flights since the war began. Those targets include over 140 Iranian naval vessels, as well as missile sites, drone and missile manufacturing facilities, and Revolutionary Guard intelligence sites. And yet, the strait is still not open to normal traffic. More than 180 ships have transited since the outbreak of the conflict, but nearly 70% of those were Iranian or allied vessels, with countries like China, India, Pakistan, and Turkey negotiating selective passage for some of their ships. Before the war, 140 ships passed through every day. That tells you everything about the difference between a military campaign and a political outcome. This is the classic insurgency logic applied to a maritime theater. You can destroy an army. You cannot destroy geography. Now let us move to the economic level, because this is where the abstract becomes viscerally real, and where it reaches ordinary people. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz has been described as the largest disruption to the energy supply since the 1970s energy crisis, and the largest in the history of the global oil market. Oil prices surged faster than during any other conflict in recent history. Brent crude surpassed $100 per barrel for the first time in 4 years on March 8th, reaching a peak of $126. Oil prices have surged more than 60% since the war began, and the International Energy Agency has warned that April will be, in its words, much worse than March. Average U.S. gasoline prices have already risen to $4.10 per gallon. That number will continue to climb. But oil is only the visible surface. Look deeper. The Gulf region produces nearly half of the world's urea and 30% of its ammonia. About 1/3 of all internationally traded fertilizer normally passes through the strait. In early March, Middle Eastern fertilizer prices rose nearly 20% compared to late February levels. If the crisis continues, global fertilizer prices could average 15 to 20% higher during the first half of 2026. And because nitrogen fertilizer production depends heavily on natural gas as a feedstock, rising energy prices are amplifying those costs further. The price shock and the shortage of fertilizer during the spring planting season could reduce the planting and yields of corn in the United States, the main feedstock for American beef, poultry, and dairy, and potentially increase global food prices into 2027. Think about what that means in practice. In New York and London, this is painful. In sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, in import-dependent economies where food constitutes 40 to 60% of household spending, this can be catastrophic. Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago President Austin Goolsbee has stated plainly that the Iran war risks fueling inflation, which would make it harder for the central bank to ease interest rates in 2026. And here is a detail that almost no one is discussing. Iran has not simply blocked the strait. It has turned the closure into a rent extraction mechanism. Countries like China, India, Pakistan, and Turkey have negotiated selective passage for some of their vessels. The strait is not uniformly closed. It is selectively opened for those who coordinate with Tehran. This is no longer only a war. It is a parallel economic system, one in which Iran is setting the terms of access to 20% of the world's oil supply. Now let us zoom out to the geopolitical and systemic level. and look at who is actually winning from this chaos. The first thing that becomes visible when you step back is that the United States has ended up largely alone in this war. Trump called on countries receiving oil through the Strait of Hormuz to take on military protection of the passage. Germany, Spain, Italy, Estonia, the United Kingdom, Australia, South Korea, Japan, and the European Union all declined that request. America's closest allies refused to stand alongside Washington, not because they are indifferent to an open strait, which is existentially important to their economies, but because they do not want to be participants in a military campaign with unpredictable consequences. A United Nations Security Council proposal that would authorize defensive action to ensure vessels can safely transit the strait has faced resistance. China and Russia have expressed concern that a resolution could justify military action near Iran and create escalation risks. This is not just a diplomatic position. It is a structural dividend. Consider what happens with each additional day the crisis continues. Oil prices rise. Russia, one of the world's largest energy exporters, earns more. The United States is consumed by a costly military campaign. Strategic attention and resources are pulled away from the Pacific theater. American allies are irritated and distancing themselves. Fractures in Western cohesion deepen. China receives Iranian oil at favorable terms, with approved vessels transiting the strait predominantly heading to China and India. Moscow and Beijing are watching Washington exhaust itself in a conflict from which they are collecting dividends without having deployed a single soldier. 5 European Union countries, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Austria, are now pushing for a windfall tax on energy companies they say are profiting from the consequences of this war. Think about that. The war is generating enough profit for energy companies that allied governments are moving to tax it. That tells you something about who is benefiting from prolonged instability. Now let us look at the institutional level, at whether the mechanisms designed to prevent exactly this kind of crisis are functioning or have been hollowed out. Indirect negotiations have been led by Vice President Vance and Iran's Speaker of Parliament Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, with the mediation of Pakistan's military chief. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and the foreign ministers of Iran, Pakistan, Turkey, and Egypt are all involved. Egypt's foreign minister has held separate calls with his regional counterparts trying to de-escalate. Diplomatic channels exist. Mediators are working. Pakistan has indicated it will continue to try to support ceasefire negotiations despite ongoing obstacles. But look carefully at who is at the center of this process. It is not the State Department, the traditional institutional backbone of American diplomacy. It is personal emissaries, directly loyal to Trump. The architecture of institutional diplomacy has been replaced by a network of personal relationships and situational alliances. That substitution matters, because institutional channels carry credibility that personal ones do not. When the gap between public rhetoric and diplomatic reality becomes too large, mediators cannot even arrange a direct meeting between the parties, and that gap is now enormous. Days ago, Trump told the American people in a primetime address that the United States has beaten and completely decimated Iran, that their radar is 100% annihilated, and that America is unstoppable as a military force. Hours later, his own social media posts were issuing deadline after deadline for Iran to open a strait that, according to that same narrative, belongs to a defeated country. Iran's foreign minister has meanwhile signaled a willingness to join talks. Iran has said it will not accept a temporary ceasefire. It wants a complete end to the war and guarantees against future attacks. Iran's conditions for ending the war include a new legal regime for the Strait of Hormuz, a direct challenge to the foundational principle of freedom of navigation that the United States has enforced for 70 years. This is the classic signature of institutional dysfunction. When public rhetoric diverges so far from diplomatic reality that mediators cannot organize a direct meeting, the system is not working. It is running on personal loyalty and improvised channels, not on durable institutions. Now let me zoom all the way out, to a 5 to 10 year horizon, because some things have already changed permanently, regardless of how this specific standoff resolves. Even if the strait opens tomorrow, Several structural facts are now part of the world's operating assumptions. The precedent has been established. The strait was traditionally never closed for extended periods during Middle Eastern conflicts. Now it has been. That means any future regional actor now knows this instrument works. The cost-benefit calculation for every future crisis in this region has shifted. The world's energy map is beginning to redraw itself. Saudi Arabia is already studying alternative pipeline routes to bypass the strait entirely. Iraq is considering reviving an old overland pipeline to the Mediterranean. These are long-term infrastructure projects that will take years, but the decision to begin them was triggered by this crisis. Once built, they permanently reduce the choke point's leverage. The geography of energy will look different in 2035 than it did in 2025. The credibility of American security guarantees has been placed under genuine scrutiny in a way that is new. When Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom publicly declined to follow Washington into a military campaign, that is not a rupture, but it is a renegotiation. Allies are recalibrating what they can count on and what they need to provide for themselves. The Federal Reserve is now factoring a war into its interest rate decisions. Stock markets swing by more than 1% on a single Truth Social post. A major Japanese shipping company became news because one of its vessels was the first Japanese ship to transit the strait since the war began. The war has threaded itself into the nervous system of the global economy in ways that do not simply reverse when a ceasefire is signed. And so, I want to leave you not with a conclusion, but with a question. One that I think sits beneath all of the tactical noise, beneath the ultimatums, the rescue missions, the oil prices, the UN votes, and the diplomatic backchannels. We are watching a crisis in which military force is not producing a political outcome, in which institutional diplomacy is being replaced by personal loyalty networks, in which the closest allies of the world's dominant power are declining to follow it, in which adversaries are collecting strategic dividends without entering the fight, and in which a 21-mile waterway is holding the global economy hostage. This is not a description only of the Strait of Hormuz. This is a description of the condition of the international order that was built over 70 years. An order premised on the idea that the United States could enforce certain foundational rules: freedom of navigation, nuclear non-proliferation, the primacy of multilateral institutions. And so the real question, the one that will define the next 20 years, is not whether Iran opens the strait. The real question is this: if the most powerful military force in human history cannot enforce freedom of passage through a 21-mile corridor, which rules of the international order still hold? And who will write the new ones? That is not a question with an answer today, but it is the question that everything else is circling around. And how it gets resolved, or whether it gets resolved, will determine what kind of world we are living in a decade from now.